The card room at Ashcombe House had gone quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when it has decided to enjoy a small cruelty. Candles burned high in their brackets, the smell of beeswax and spilled ratafia thick in the warm air, and at the long green table the play had stopped, though no hand had yet been laid down. Catherine Vane stood at the edge of it in a gown of plain grey muslin that had been turned twice at the hem, and she understood, with the calm that comes after a person has stopped expecting kindness, that she had been brought here to be made an example of. The Dowager Countess of Mardale had asked her a question. The question had been designed to have no good answer. And the whole of the room, 36 of the best people in the county, waited to watch a portionless gentlewoman fail to find one. She did not fail to find one. That was the thing none of them would forget. If you have ever stood in a room that had already decided what you were, stay with this story, because the woman in the gray gown was about to become a great deal harder to forget than the people who had summoned her to be forgotten. Now let us go back to how she came to be standing there at all. Catherine had not been born to turn hems. Her father had been a clergyman of modest living and immodest learning, a man who taught his only daughter Latin because he could not afford to send her brothers to school and could not bear for any mind in his house to go untaught. When he died in the spring of her 23rd year, he left her a shelf of books, a small annuity that died with the house it was secured against, and a reputation for being clever, which in a woman without money is reckoned a kind of debt. She had come to Ashcombe as companion to old Mrs. Zix Penhallow, a position that paid little and demanded much, and that placed her, on the evening of the autumn assembly, at the precise social altitude where a dowager countess might use her for sport, without anyone of consequence objecting. The dowager had been objecting to Catherine since the day she arrived. It was not personal, or it had not begun personal. The dowager objected on principle to educated women of no fortune, the way she objected to drafts and to the new fashion for shorter sleeves, as things that let the cold in. But it had become personal 3 weeks ago. And the reason it had become personal was standing at the far end of the card room with his back to the fire, saying nothing, watching everything. The room had a name for Catherine. She had heard it first from a footman who did not know she was near, then from a lady's maid who did not care. And now she would hear it from the dowager herself, the blue stocking they called her. And they did not mean it as praise. To the assembly she was the bluey stocking, the parson's clever girl with her nose in a book and her gown gone gray at the seams, a woman who had committed the unforgivable error of having a mind and no means to make it ornamental. The label had a sound to it that pleased the people who used it. It made her small. It made her safe to mock. The man at the fire was Julian Hartwell, Duke of Ravensmere. He was the reason the card room was full. He had inherited the dukedom 11 months before from a cousin he had scarcely known, had come north to take possession of an estate he had never wanted, and had spent the autumn declining every invitation but the ones he could not refuse without insult. The county had decided he was proud. The county was wrong, but the county was rarely told when it was wrong. And so the verdict stood. He was perhaps 32, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked carved, and a way of holding still that made other men's movements seem fussy by comparison. When he entered a room, conversation arranged itself around his silence. When he left one, people remembered things they wished they had not said. What the county did not know was that the Duke had been listening to Catherine Vane for 3 weeks, and that he had not been able to stop. It had begun in the library at Ashcombe, which the Duke used because it was the one room where no one followed him, and where Catherine came on Mrs. Penhallow's behalf to fetch the volumes the old lady liked to read aloud. He had been standing in the window with a book of his late cousin's that he had not understood, a treatise on the drainage of the eastern fields, written in a Latin gone slippery with bad copying, and he had said half to himself and half to the empty room that the man who wrote it had clearly never seen a wet field in his life. Catherine, reaching past him for Mrs. Penhallow's sermons, had said, without thinking that the error was not in the fields, but in the third declension, and that if his grace would permit her, the sentence he was glaring at meant the opposite of what he believed it to mean. He had permitted her. That was the first thing about him that surprised her. The second was that he had listened, fully the way her father used to listen, as though her being right mattered more than her being the one who was right. He had handed her the book without comment and stood a little apart while she found the offending line, and when she set her finger to the word and explained how the case ending had been miscopied, how a single stroke of a tired clerk's pen had turned a wet field into a dry one, and the whole instruction on its head, he had not laughed and he had not flattered. He had said only, "Show me the next," and the next, and they had gone on. They had stood at the window for the better part of an hour while the light went from the room, and a footman came in to draw the curtains and went out again, uncertain whether to disturb them. She had translated his cousin's treatise, sentence by sentence, and he had asked questions that were not the questions of a proud man, but of a man who genuinely did not know and was unashamed to learn why the eastern fields and not the southern, whether the clerk's error was carelessness or ignorance. What her father would have made of a manor run on Latin, no one in the house could read. When she left, he had said only, "Come again tomorrow. The books will not read themselves." And she had gone away with her heart doing something foolish that she spent the whole night instructing it to stop. She had not let herself believe it meant anything. A woman in her position who let herself believe such things was a woman preparing her own humiliation. She told herself he was bored, that a clever companion was a novelty to a man trapped in the country, that he would tire of her as the gentry tired of everything once the season called them south. She told herself this every morning, and unlearned it every afternoon, because every afternoon he was in the library, and every afternoon he listened, and her body had begun to know the sound of his step in the corridor before her mind would consent to recognize it. The Dowager had noticed. The Dowager noticed everything that threatened the order she had spent 60 years maintaining, and a duke spending his afternoons with a portionless companion was a threat of the first water. She had a remedy prepared. Her remedy was her granddaughter, Lady Sophia Marsh, lately arrived from London, golden-haired and accomplished and possessed of £40,000, who had been brought north for the express purpose of becoming the Duchess of Ravensmere before the Bluestocking could do anything so absurd as become memorable. Lady Sophia was not unkind. She was simply certain, in the way of a woman who has never once been told she was anything but the answer, and her certainty made her cruel without her ever needing to try. And so the Dowager had arranged the card-room. She had let it be known that the Duke would attend, which ensured that everyone of consequence attended also. She had seated Lady Sophia, where the candlelight loved her best, and she had summoned the companion on the pretext of needing a fourth at whist, which everyone present understood to be no pretext at all but an invitation to a hanging. The first voicing came early, before the cards were even dealt. Catherine had crossed to the table, and the Dowager had looked at her over the edge of a fan held precisely half an inch too high, and had said to Lady Sophia, in a voice pitched to carry, that one must make allowances, that the parson's Bluestocking could not be expected to know how to conduct herself among people of fashion, that it was a kindness really to let her observe how it was done. Lady Sophia had laughed, a small silver laugh that cost her nothing. Catherine had felt the heat climb her throat, and had kept her face still, because the one thing she had learned in 2 years of service was that the only dignity available to her was the dignity of not flinching where they could see. She had not looked at the Duke. She could not have borne to see him watching her be made small. But the Duke had been watching, and something had happened in his face that no one troubled to read, because no one in that room had ever needed to read the Duke of Ravensmere's face, to know what he thought. He told them what he thought. That was the privilege of his rank. The fact that he had said nothing should have warned them. It did not. The cards were dealt. Catherine played, and played well, because her father had taught her whist on winter evenings as a way of teaching her to count, and to remember, and to read the intentions of others from small signs, and a clever woman at a card table is a dangerous thing to a person who has staked her authority on that woman being a fool. She watched the discards the way her father had shown her, marked which suits the Dowager protected, and which she threw, read the half-deaf squire's hand from the way he sorted it, and held it too far from his chest. She let the Dowager believe the early tricks were luck. She lost the small ones on purpose and kept the count in her head, and when the rubber turned, she took it back, trick by trick, the squire blinking beside her as cards he had thought lost came home. The dowager lost the first rubber. She lost it because Catherine, partnered with a man who would have lost it for her, had carried them both through 3 tricks that should not have been winnable. The last of them, a long suit established from a single card, laid down 4 turns before anyone but Catherine had understood why. The dowager gathered the cards herself, which a hostess does not do, and her smile thinned to a line. The temperature of the room changed, by a degree no instrument could measure, but everyone present could feel. Now, you may comment if you have known a room like that, where being good at the thing was the worst crime you could commit. But stay with Catherine because she had not yet committed her real crime, and the Duke had not yet committed his. The dowager changed her tactics. If the companion would not be made foolish at cards, she would be made foolish at conversation where the rules were hers to write. She turned the talk to a subject she believed safe, a poem then fashionable in London. All sighs and ruined abbeys, which Lady Sophia praised in the approved phrases and which the table agreed to admire. And then the dowager, scenting an opening, asked Catherine what the bluey stocking made of it. Was it not the finest thing? Did she not find it powerfully affecting? The trap was simple. To agree was to be a parrot. To disagree was to be presumptuous, a companion contradicting her betters on a matter of taste. There was no third door. Everyone at the table knew there was no third door, and they leaned in to watch her walk into the wall. Catherine set down her cards. She did not rush. She had learned that too, that the woman who answers quickly answers as the frightened answer, and she was tired, that night, of being frightened. She let the silence sit a moment longer than was comfortable, until the table leaned in, expecting her to stammer. She said that she found the poem skillfully made, which was true, and that she admired the craft of it, which was also true, and then she said, the thing that no one had expected, which was that she did not believe a ruin was sad. She said that the poet wept over the broken abbey as though the breaking were the whole of its story, but that a ruin was only sad to a person who had forgotten that something had once been whole there, had once been built by hands that meant it, stone laid on stone by people who would never see it finished and built it anyway. She said that what moved her was not the falling, but the building, not the loss, but the fact that anyone had ever cared enough to raise the stones at all. She said that grief, which forgot what it grieved for, was only self-regard, wearing mourning, and that she preferred the poets who remembered the living thing to the poets who only loved the corpse of it. The room did not know what to do with that. It had come to watch a woman be small, and had instead been told something true, and the truth had landed in the particular silence of people who recognize they have just heard a better thought than any they brought with them. The dowager's fan stopped moving. Lady Sophia's smile became uncertain at the edges, and the Duke of Ravensmere, who had not spoken in an hour, who had stood at the fire like something carved, turned his head and looked at Catherine Vane with an attention so complete that 2 people at the table noticed it and would speak of it for a week. Catherine did not see him look. She was gathering her cards, her hands steady by an act of will, her heart loud enough that she was certain the squire beside her could hear it. She had spoken last, and she had spoken true, and she knew already that she would pay for it. The clever woman who wins is forgiven nothing. She had made the dowager small in the dowager's own room, and the dowager was not a woman who forgot such things. And Catherine went to her narrow bed that night, and lay awake calculating how the bill would come. It came within the week, and it came dressed as charity. The dowager called upon Mrs. Penhallow on a wet afternoon, all warmth and concern, and sat with her an hour over the good china, and observed that the old lady looked tired, that a companion who gadded about the great houses could hardly be giving her mistress the attention an invalid required, that she had heard, only heard, and would not have repeated it to anyone less dear, that the companion had been making rather free in the Ashcombe library with a gentleman far above her station, and that of course she said nothing against Miss Vane's character, only that appearances mattered so terribly to a household's good name, and that were she and Mrs. Parr, Penhallow's place, she would think very carefully about whom she kept under her roof. It was masterful. It accused nothing and ruined everything. It left no sentence. Mrs. Bipe. Penhallow could repeat to Catherine as a charge, because no charge had been made. Only a fog of concern that settled over the house and would not lift. Mrs. Barry. Penhallow, who was old and frightened of the dowager and fond of Catherine, in the helpless way of a woman who has no power to protect what she is fond of, wept and apologized and twisted her handkerchief into a rope, and gave Catherine a fortnight's notice, and a character reference so carefully neutral that any reader would understand exactly what it declined to say. So that was the second voicing, carried to Catherine third hand by a tearful old woman who could not meet her eyes. The bluey stocking, the dowager had said, making rather free above her station. Catherine heard it, and understood that she was finished in the county, that no respectable house would take a companion turned off under such a shadow, that she had spoken last, and spoken loudest at a card table and would now lose her bread for it. She did not weep. She packed her father's books into the one trunk she owned, and she sat among them in the cold little room, and she thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that she did not regret the thing she had said. She would say it again. That was the trouble with her. She had never learned to be sorry for being right. What she did not know, sitting among her father's books, was why the Duke of Ravensmere had stopped coming to the library. He had stopped the day after the card room. She had told herself it was the natural thing, that he had seen the cost of his attention and withdrawn it, like a sensible man, that whatever the afternoons had been, they were over now. And she had been right to never let herself believe in them. She did not know that he had stopped coming because he had gone to London. She did not know what he had gone to London to do. She had wrapped the silence around herself as proof that she had been a fool, and she carried that proof to the cold room with her father's books, and she made it her companion in place of the wages she had lost. Here is what the library afternoons had cost the Duke, and what he had never said, because saying it was a thing he did not yet know how to do. He had been married once. The county knew this, and the county had decided. It explained his coldness. A young duke widowed and soured, and the county was wrong about that too. His wife had been chosen for him at 23, a sweet, frightened girl named Eleanor, with no more wish to marry him than he had to marry her, and they had spent 4 years being courteous strangers in a large house, until a fever took her in a single hard week. He had been kind to her in the way one is kind to a guest. He had asked after her health and her comfort and whether the rooms suited her, and he had never once asked her what she thought, or feared, or wanted, because it had not occurred to him that the answers would be worth the having. What had wounded him was not her death. And what had wounded him was that he had stood at her bedside at the end, holding the hand of a woman he had lived beside for 4 years, and understood that he could not have said what she loved, or what frightened her, or what she had wished her life to be, because he had never asked, and now there was no asking left. He had not been cruel to her. He had been worse than cruel. He had been absent, present in the house, and absent from her entirely, and she had died, having been seen by her husband no more truly than a piece of the furniture is seen. He had carried that since. He had decided, in the cold, private way he decided everything, that he was a man who did not truly see people, and that it was safer for everyone, if he kept to himself, the company of a man who could do no further harm. And then a parson's daughter had reached past him for a book of sermons, and told him he had the declension wrong, and had stood at the window translating drainage treatises, with her whole quick mind lit up like a window at dusk, and he had found himself asking her questions, to which he wanted badly the true answers. He had seen her. That was the thing that undid him. After 4 years of believing himself a man who could not see a person, he had looked at Catherine Vane and seen her entirely, and the seeing had felt like the first warm day after a winter he had thought permanent. He had gone to London, not to escape her, but because of something she had said at the card table. About building, and not only losing, about grief that forgot what it grieved for, and he had recognized himself in it, with a force that drove him out of the county to do the one thing that might make the seeing mean something. But Catherine knew none of this. Catherine knew only the cold room and the fortnight's notice, and the silence. And on the last gray morning of her service, she did a thing that had nothing to do with the Duke at all. A thing she did because she could not help it, and it was this thing the Duke would learn of when he returned, and it was this thing that decided him past all turning back. There was a child at Ashcombe, a scullery girl of perhaps 9 called Bess, motherless, half-starved, and quick as a sparrow, whom the cook beat for breakages and the household ignored otherwise. Catherine had been teaching her letters. She had done it in stolen quarter hours, in the kitchen passage, with a slate and a stub of chalk, asking nothing and telling no one, because the child had a hungry mind, and Catherine could not watch a hungry mind go unfed, any more than her father could have. The girl had learned her alphabet in a fortnight, and had begun on words, and she hid the slate behind the flour barrel between lessons, and guarded the secret of it like treasure, and Catherine had come to look for those quarter hours in the passage, more than she would have admitted, because they were the one part of her service that asked nothing of her but the thing she was best at giving. On her last morning, the cook caught them at it, the slate out, the chalk in the child's fist, a row of crooked letters spelling the girl's own name. The cook flew into a rage, swore the child had stolen the chalk from the still-room, and raised her hand to strike. And Catherine, who had every reason to keep her head down on her last morning in a house that was turning her out, who had nothing left to lose but also nothing left to gain, stepped between the cook and the child and took the blow meant for Bess across her own forearm. It landed hard. The sting of it brought water to her eyes, and she did not let it fall. She stood there with her arm throbbing and her voice perfectly level and said that the chalk was hers, that she had given it, that the letters on the slate were her doing and not the child's, that if anyone was to be struck for the teaching of a child to read, it would have to be the woman who did the teaching, and that she would stand in that passage all morning to be struck if it came to that, but the child would not be touched again. The cook had not struck her again. There are limits, even in a kitchen, and a gentlewoman, standing between you and a child with her arm already bruised and her eyes steady, is a thing few people can keep hitting. Catherine had taken Bess by the hand and finished the lesson. Then she had gone up to her cold room and waited out her last hours, and she had not known that the steward's wife had seen the whole of it from the passage, and that the steward's wife told the steward, and that the steward, who was an honest man troubled by the turning off of a decent woman, was waiting to tell the Duke the moment his carriage came up the drive. The Duke's carriage came up the drive on a Thursday in a cold rain, with the matter in London concluded. He heard 3 things before he had got his coat off. He heard from his steward that Miss Vane had been dismissed on the Dowager's whisper. He heard that she was to leave the county on the morning coach, with a ruined character, and nowhere to go. And he heard in detail with the steward's wife brought in to tell it plain, what Catherine had done in the kitchen on her last morning, how she had put her own arm between a child and a blow on the very day the house was casting her out, how she had asked for nothing and claimed the fault as her own to spare a scullery girl a beating. The Duke listened to all of it, standing in his wet coat in the hall. And when the steward's wife had finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked one question, which was where Miss Vane was at that present hour, and the steward said she was still in the house, that the coach did not leave until morning. The Dowager Countess of Mardale was at Ashcombe that evening. She had come, with Lady Sophia, to dine and to enjoy the fruit of her labor, the companion gone by morning and the field cleared for the granddaughter. The dining room was full. The county had assembled again, drawn by the Duke's return, as the county was always drawn, and the Dowager presided over the long table in diamonds, with Lady Sophia at her right hand, and an empty confidence in her breast, because she had won, and winning was the only weather she had ever known. The third voicing happened at that table, and it was the loudest, because the Dowager could not resist it. The talk had turned, as talk will, to the matter of the dismissed companion, and someone asked, half in malice and half in genuine ignorance, what had become of the parson's clever girl. And the Dowager, certain of her ground, certain the Duke's silence at the card-room had been distaste, and not its opposite, said that the blue stocking had got above herself, that a companion who made free with her betters, and filled the scullery child's head with letters she had no business knowing, was a corrupting influence in any decent house, and that she for one was glad to see the back of her. She set it down the length of the table, in the full hearing of the assembled county, with the satisfaction of a woman laying the final stone on a wall she had built with her own hands. She did not see the Duke set down his glass. He did it without haste. He did everything without haste. And the room, which had learned over 11 months to fall silent when the Duke of Ravensmere moved, fell silent now. He rose from his place at the head of the table. He did not look at the dowager. He looked down the long table to where the door stood, and he said, in a voice that was not raised at all, and that every person in the room heard as though it had been, that he would have Miss Vane sent for, that she would dine at his table tonight, and that he wished it understood by everyone present that she was to be addressed as the future Duchess of Ravensmere. That was the whole of it. 12 words of consequence and not one wasted. He did not enumerate the dowager's cruelties. He did not raise his voice to her. He did not so much as turn his head to watch her face fall. He had learned from a woman in a gray gown that the loudest thing a person can say is the true thing said plainly, and so he said the true thing plainly, and let it be the loudest thing in the room. A footman went for Catherine. The dowager sat very still, her fan forgotten in her lap, her mouth working once around a sentence that did not come. And beside her Lady Sophia, who was not stupid, understood in a single cold instant that she had been brought 400 miles to lose, and that she had lost not to a fortune or a face, but to a parson's daughter who had said something true at a card table. And her certainty, the certainty of a lifetime, cracked clean across like ice over a river in a thaw. Catherine came to the dining room not knowing why she had been summoned. She had thought, climbing the stairs, that perhaps the dowager wished one final public humiliation before the morning coach, and she had set her face to endure it, because enduring was the one thing she still knew how to do. She came through the door in her plain gray gown, with her father's smallest book of poems in her apron pocket where she always carried it, and she stopped at the threshold, and she saw the whole bright room turn toward her, and the Duke standing at the head of the table with his eyes on her. He crossed the room to her. He did not wait for her to come to him, which a duke might have done, and no one would have faulted. He crossed the whole length of that watching room, and he stopped before her, close enough that she had to look up, and he said her name. He said Catherine, as though it were the first word in a language she had only just learned to speak, and it was the first time he had ever used her given name, and the marked strangeness of it in his mouth told her more than the 12 words at the table had told the county. She heard her own name in his voice, and her body knew the truth of it before her mind would let her believe it, the warmth flooding up her throat, her pulse loud, her hand rising of its own accord to press against the small book in her pocket, as though to be sure she was awake. He told her then, low, for her and not for the room, that he had gone to London to settle a thing he should have settled weeks ago, that he had been to the bishop and to his own solicitor, that there was a living standing empty in the gift of the dukedom, a parish in the southern country with a good house and a better library, and that he had meant it for a clergyman of learning, and that he had thought, the whole of the journey, of her father, and of the books she carried, and had wished her father living to take it. He said he could not give her father the living. He said he had done the only thing he could, which was to make certain that no whisper from any countess living would ever again decide whether Catherine Vane had a roof, because the roof would be his, and so would the name, if she would have a man who had been 4 years married once and learned nothing, and had then been taught everything in a library, in the course of 3 weeks, by a woman reaching past him for a book of sermons. She should have answered with grace. She had grace in abundance. But the thing she felt was too large for grace, and so she said the true thing plainly, the way he had, the way she had at the card table. She said that she had told herself for 3 weeks that the afternoons meant nothing, because believing they meant something was the surest way she knew to be made a fool. She said she was tired of instructing her own heart to be sensible. She said, looking up at him in front of the whole county that had decided she was nothing, that she had wanted him since the third declension, which was not a thing a sensible woman confessed in a crowded room, and that she found she no longer wished to be sensible. And the Duke of Ravensmere, who had not been seen to smile in 11 months, smiled, and the two people at the table who had noticed his look at the card room now had a great deal more to speak of, for a great deal longer than a week. The dowager did not stay to dine. She rose, gathered the wreck of her dignity, and made her farewells in the clipped half-sentences of a woman whose script has failed her in the one place it was never meant to fail. And the county, which had assembled to watch a companion humiliated, watched instead a countess withdraw, and drew its own conclusions, and revised by morning every opinion it had held the night before. The crowd's verdict, which had made Catherine the bluey stocking, unmade her in an evening, and remade her as the future duchess. And there is a lesson in how quickly it turned, but Catherine, who knew exactly what the verdict was worth, did not trouble to learn it. She had never lived for the room's opinion. She was not about to begin, now that the room had changed its mind. They were married in the spring, in the small southern parish whose living the Duke had spoken of, with the good house and the better library standing ready. And the wedding was small by the standards of a dukedom, which was how both of them wanted it. Bess came south with them. Catherine had refused to leave the child to the cook's mercy, and the Duke had not so much as asked why, had only arranged it, the way he arranged things now for Catherine, without needing the reason spelled out. And Bess grew up in the southern house with the run of the better library, and her letters mastered, and a quickness that would one day make her a governess in her own right, which is a thing that could not have happened in a kitchen, and which happened because a woman with a bruised arm had stood between her and a blow on the worst morning of that woman's life. If this story has stayed with you, you might tell someone of it the way the best things are passed hand to hand, but stay a moment longer, because the story does not end at the wedding. It ends, as these things do, on an ordinary evening, some years on. It was winter in the southern parish, and the snow had come down soft past the library windows all afternoon, and the fire was low and warm, and the Duke of Ravensmere sat in the deep chair with a book of his late cousin's open on his knee, the very treatise on the drainage of the eastern fields, the slippery Latin of it, which he kept, not because he cared a straw for drainage, but because it had been the occasion of the first true thing anyone had said to him in years. Catherine sat across from him with her father's smallest book of poems in her hands, the one she had carried in her apron pocket through every gray morning of her service, its spine gone soft with handling, and she was reading aloud the way her father had taught her, slow and warm. And the Duke was listening the way he had listened in the window. That first dusk, fully as though her being right about the poem mattered more than anything in the falling snow. She came to a poem about a ruin, the kind she had once said she did not love, and she paused over it, and the Duke looked up from the slippery Latin and said, "Lo, the words level," that he remembered. She knew what he remembered. She had said at a card table in another county a lifetime ago, that grief, which forgot what it grieved for, was only self-regard in mourning, and that what moved her was the building and not the falling. He had remembered it from that night to this one. He had never forgotten a word of it, the thing she had said when she spoke last, and spoke loudest in a room that had brought her there to be silent. And he told her so now in the firelight, with the snow coming down, that he had carried her words out of that room, and they had been the building of everything that came after. Catherine closed her father's book over her thumb to keep the place. Outside, the snow went on falling, soft and certain, over the good house and the better library and the parish that was theirs, over the window she had long since stopped thinking of as anyone's but her own. She looked at the man who had crossed a watching room to say her name, and she did not say anything clever, because there was no one left to be clever for, and that she had found was its own kind of homecoming. She opened the book again and went on reading. The fire settled. The snow came down. And in the deep chair, the Duke of Ravensmere closed his eyes and listened to the last thing he had ever wanted to hear, which was the voice of the lady who had spoken last, going on and on into the warm and ordinary dark,